Welcome. We're going to have a conversation today coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco. And we're going to be talking about a new report just been issued today called "Is It Time for a 490 BC Project?" I'm joined by one of the authors of the study, Dr. Williamson Evers. Welcome, Dr. Evers.
Thank you.
I think I can call you Bill since we're colleagues.
Yes.
It's a pleasure to have you, Bill. And this report is pretty interesting. I mean, it's pretty provocative when you look at that title. The question mark, I think, is an important part of the title. Is it time for a 490 BC project? This is the paper. It's available on the Independent Institute website. Go to independent.org and you'll find it featured in the center of our main webpage. Just published it yesterday, right, Bill? And you have two co-authors. Tell us who they are.
So one is Morgan Hunter, and Morgan is a brand new PhD from University of California at Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was a visiting scholar at the Stanford Classics Department this last year, and she was also a visiting fellow at our Independent Institute. And the other is Victor Davis Hanson. Victor is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's a frequent commentator on Fox News.
Indeed, yeah.
He's a specialist in ancient Greek farming, military, the makeup of the military, the strategy of the military, and also, obviously, he comments on many, many things beyond that, but he was particularly applying his classics background in writing this report. He has a PhD in classics from Stanford.
Yeah, he's a pretty impressive scholar. And of course, I've seen him on TV.
Yes.
So, this study, it comes at an interesting time. We've just started the school year in most parts of the United States. A lot of it's apparently, digital or virtual rather than in person.
Right.
But people are thinking about their children's education, and students are starting to get back into the saddle. What really bothers me about the current moment, intellectually and culturally in America, is the way that America's school children are really kind of in the crosshairs of all sorts of ideological agendas that are pushing them this way or the other. To me, they kind of look like pawns in a struggle. So, by way of example, President Trump has just announced the 1776 Commission, which he says is going to be promoting patriotic education because he's sick and tired, he says, of all this denigration of America. And of course, he's referring then, he's sounding a little propagandistic himself, but then he's referring to something that has a clearly propagandistic profile, namely this 1619 project that the New York Times Magazine printed in 2019, which basically says that 1619, when slaves were first introduced into Virginia, is the true founding date of America. And it's pretty heavy-duty stuff. I noticed that there are curricula being developed based upon the 1619 project across the country, and they're linked to some of the ideological themes of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'll give you an example, and then you can just make a comment or two before we kind of turn to the antidote. But I saw today that the Buffalo Public Schools have a critical race curriculum, and in the second and third and fourth grades, they're taught how important the Black Lives Matter movement is, all capital letters. And then second graders have to write pledge cards vowing to speak up on the basis of this kind of thing. And then later on, fifth and sixth graders are told that George Washington represents, quote, the beginnings of 273 years of hypocrisy in America. And this is what our school children are getting from one side, and then we're getting President Trump from some side. You're aware of all this stuff, and suddenly you're giving us 490 BC, but we're talking about 1619 and 1776. What's the deal here, Bill?
Well, I think so. The White House just had a conference on American history, and Trump's speech was at the end of that. And a lot of criticisms were voiced at this conference of how American history is being taught today, and particularly this critical race theory, and which is associated with the political movement Black Lives Matter. So, first of all, I agree generally with all these criticisms that were made, including the criticisms that the president made.
Yeah, some of his weren't bad.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say, before I explain what the critical race theory is say something also about the president's idea. So generally in America, in the public schools, we leave curriculum content decisions to the states and localities and not to the federal government. Indeed, there are multiple statutes, including the Every Child Succeeds Act, that reaffirmed this, that the federal government was not supposed to intrude into curriculum. Now, I'm sure the president's lawyers have their own way of looking at this, but I just think this is bad policy, and it is against federal statute, and it's against really our constitutional design. So I don't really think he should be doing this. Of course, I hope whatever they do is better rather than worse, but they really shouldn't be doing it, particularly in a sensitive area. I mean, it's one thing, I don't really like this either, but let's say NASA, the Aeronautics and Space Administration, makes something about a little module for lessons on space travel. That's not really as damaging as a whole curriculum for American history. That's much more intrusive, and we really don't want that. We want to be a pluralistic country with competition between the states. So now let's get to what is going on in terms of the 1619 project.
Which is what President Trump is reacting to all of that. I mean, he is. Everyone's reacting to one another.
He's in a bad situation, because here is this intellectually dominant progressive movement that has huge control in the public schools, and they're trying to brainwash children. They're trying to indoctrinate children, and I can hardly be surprised that he would react against this. So let me just say something about what the form of this indoctrination is, and then we can go on to the 490 BC. So the idea of these people, the critical racial people, is that everything is really a struggle between races. I mean, this is just like old white supremacists and Hitler's National Socialists.
They agree on those underlying things. They're just from the opposite side.
They just flip it. Okay,
everything is race. Everything is race.
Yeah, but instead of Hitler having the Jews be the demons, in this thing the whites are the demons. Okay, so the whole idea is blacks get introduced to the United States as slaves, and everything else is just a cover-up. Everything about the Constitution, about the Declaration of Independence, about any other thing, it's all a cover-up to the idea of keeping dominance, hegemony of whites over blacks.
Right. I mean, and that's why this curriculum in Buffalo, based upon Black Lives Matter, says it's the beginnings of 273 years of hypocrisy in America, as if that's the center of the American story.
It's clearly not. And if anything, the American political culture is a steady accretion of rights and freedom.
That's right.
Expanding liberty, and the ideas that were there at the American founding had a subversive effect on slavery and delegitimized slavery and made the Southerners always feel they were on their back foot because the ideals of the country were against them.
Right.
And, that's a story that ought to be taught to children.
That's what Frederick Douglass said at the time, before the Civil War. He argued that the American founding and the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution had always been set against slavery from the beginning and needed to be.
And it just had to unfold and be pushed through. That's right.
Right.
So in a sense, our 490 BC, I first need to clarify what happened in 490 BC.
Right. Like everyone's scratching their head trying to remember their history lessons.
Good, because that's like saying, at least to Americans, 1066. All British schoolboys and schoolgirls know what happened in 1066, but not necessarily all Americans.
Battle of Hastings.
Yes. Okay. So this is sort of the Battle of Hastings of the Greco-Persian Wars. So
Mm-hmm.
it's the year that the Greeks, and in particular, we're talking about the Athenians, defeated the Persians. So the Persians had landed at Marathon,
Mm-hmm.
and the Greeks smashed them. And it was not an easy thing to do because there were hordes of Persians. And although, at other times the Persians defeated the Greeks, this was extremely important. We have the Marathon race today because
Mm-hmm.
of the distance between Marathon and Athens.
Oh, that's where that number comes from.
Yes, that's the distance.
I never knew that.
The man that ran it also ran to Sparta and back and then died.
Wow.
So that's much farther.
Yeah.
So he was obviously a very incredible long distance runner to have made it. But so that's what the origin of the marathon race is.
If Greece had not won the battle, they would have been absorbed into the whole Persian system, which was, I think, a very unitary, centralized, essentially suppressive tyranny.
Well, it depended who the ruler was. The Persians actually, if you remember, gave freedom to the Jews to return and to rebuild their temple. But it was a fairly centralized system. The Greeks had been essentially city-states that leagued together for defense under various situations, and which they remained in that form until Philip Macedon and Alexander took them over. And so they had competition between the different cities for glory, for artistic endeavor, for all sorts of different things. And that made for a lively civilization, which is the foundation of our civilization today.
I have read that after the Battle of Marathon, it opened the way for what succeeding decades became known as the Golden Age of Athenian democracy.
Right, and the latter part of that is known also as the Age of Pericles.
Right.
So this meant there was that the bulk of the male citizens could participate in politics and debate. They had lots of debate. They had filling of public offices by lottery, and they had a variety of competing institutions. The Spartans, really not the society to emulate, but they had some features that were interesting. The women in Sparta had greater rights, greater property owning capacity. They had checks and balances. They had things like two kings and various things that blocked tyranny from there. But we can't really look too happily on Sparta because it was a military society. It was like an army. It was like an army in camp, the whole city, and they had a suppressed class of state slaves. Kind of think of like the penal system of Stalin's Russia, but proportionally even bigger. So those are the helots, and they were state slaves. They may have been a neighboring people that were, defeated, and we don't really know exactly the origin of them, but they were there. So anyway, but the good things from Sparta were looked at by other Greeks, the Romans. The good things in Athens were looked at. And so we go through, we have the Roman Republic with its strong sense of opposition to tyranny and despotism.
Yeah, and for its era, a remarkable degree of participation.
Yes, a lot of participation, a lot of checks and balances. Some of, it's not necessarily that they were so much designed. They weren't sometimes thought through in a way, but it wasn't like somebody started out the very earliest days and had the tribunes in there and the Senate doing this and the consuls doing that. But over time, they developed a somewhat balanced mixed system, which served them pretty well. Again, I don't want to...
Until the empire, it fended off autocracy, you might say.
Yes, it did, but I don't want to... Again, just like with the Greeks, I think it's...
They were all flawed.
They were very flawed
They
in
were
many
all
ways,
flawed.
and the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, was hugely expansionary, hugely imperialistic. Plenty of the expansion occurred before Augustus. So
Right, right. And yet the Roman Empire was so remarkable because the sense
it
of
had,
Roman law,
yes,
universally applicable regardless of,
and of
your
course the extent of
ethnicity.
the extent of the
Yeah.
market, which happened both under Alexander's empire
Mm-hmm.
and even the succeeding Hellenistic empires, but also the Roman Empire meant there was law and order and capacity to trade across
Right.
thousands of miles.
Okay, so here's the question. Half of our listeners right now are asking this question, so I might as well voice it because I know they're thinking, what's this got to do with us?
Well, if we don't, so think back. So we have a city, Utica, New York. We have a city, Cincinnati, Ohio.
There's a Rome, New York, too.
There's a Rome, New York, too. So there's a Rome, Georgia. There's
Athens, Georgia.
Athens, Georgia. And even, Tennessee, there's a model of the Parthenon. There's all sorts of things out there. And I mean, look at our buildings in Washington, D.C. Right. It's not an accident that have the Greco-Roman themes with
absolutely
Corinthian columns, Doric columns, Ionic columns.
So, but it's not just the art.
So no, it's not. And so why did they call it Utica? Well, because Utica is a place in North Africa near Tunis where Cato the Younger held the last military stand against Julius Caesar taking over the Roman Republic. This is Cato the Younger. And so he's also called Cato Utensius. Mm-hmm. So why? And Joseph Addison, who is a British playwright, poet, and most famously essayist. So Addison and Steele were the origins of The Spectator, a magazine that still exists. Mm-hmm. And they wrote the Roger de Coverley papers and the other things. But Addison wrote a play called Cato. This was George Washington's favorite play. Over multiple decades, he cites passages from it in his letters.
Because Cato was the exemplar of the selfless statesman.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So there's Cato the Elder and Cato the Younger. So Cato the Elder is famous for Carthage must be destroyed. So every time he talked about anything or he had a conversation with you, at the end, he would say, Carthago delenda est. Okay, so Carthage must be destroyed. He was a militant anti-Carthage Punic Wars man. But Cato the Younger was, like Cicero, an upholder of the Republic against the tendency under the Civil War that went on. We had Sulla versus Marius, and we had First Triumvirate and all the stuff that ate away at the Republic over time. Mm-hmm. So Cato was the last military defender of the Republic. So Pompey had already been defeated, so forth. So Washington may have put on he may have put on the play Cato.
Oh,
in Valley Forge. Mm-hmm. There is a letter.
You mean with the soldiers that winter?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, again, some people think the letter is a forgery that discusses this, but anyway, there's plenty of people that think he did this, and he certainly loved the play. And why Cincinnati? Well, it's because of Cincinnatus, who was a Roman general, who was a farmer, and he was a good general, and he left his farm to become the commander, and the commander was called a dictator. So he had complete power for Rome for this time period where he was the military leader. He defeated Rome's enemies, and then he went back to his farm. He insisted he was not going to be a political leader.
Yeah, this is the famous part.
Yes. So all this generation of the American founding, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, Washington, they all were familiar with this. And not just them, but people going forward into the 19th century, into the 1800s. People were familiar with this classical history. And
well, they were familiar, for example, with the ways in which many of those founding statesmen had a very deep suspicion of what they called democracy, that is to say, rule of the mass public. And that's why they wanted a republic, not a democracy, because
that is true.
Pure democracy just does whatever mob whim does, but carefully constructed.
So ancient Greek history, ancient Roman history shows the danger of demagogues,
Yeah.
the dangers of pure democracy, that political passion should be filtered and should be allowed to cool, that there should be checks and balances, that there shouldn't be.
Sounds like the Federalist Papers.
Shouldn't be, well, of course, the three authors of the Federalist Papers knew this well, and they called themselves, as their collective authorship, Publius, for a reason. They were hearkening back to classical political thinking. So nobody tried to copy exactly these ancient
They were drawing lessons from what...
That's right.
Yeah.
They thought, what can we learn? What can we learn from the Venetian Republic? What can we learn from Genoa? These are republics in the Renaissance period. What and so forth. What did the British history tell us? What did Magna Carta tell us? What did the English Civil War and the struggle of Parliament versus Stuart dynasty's despotism and absolute rule? What can we learn from these things? And so you see a lot of this in the Bill of Rights, but you also see it in the structure of the first three articles, where the president has certain delimited powers, the Supreme Court has certain delimited powers, the legislature has its designated powers.
In your report, at one point, you make a pretty pithy comment that every good biography of a person starts with their childhood. And so when we're trying to understand our own civilization, you need to know its infancy.
Right, and its heritage. Because, so if you think, or scholars, there's an idea called the Axial Age, and this refers to back to the idea that Karl Jaspers is a German thinker who came up with this idea, but other people have had approximately the same idea. So it's interesting to us, looking back, that within a few hundred years, you see a restatement of Judaism, you see Christianity, you see Buddhism, you see special formulation of Confucianism, you see a reformulation of Taoism, you see changes in Indian, Southeast Asia, Indian religion.
An extraordinary period in human history.
In world history, right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not like in 1 year, it's over several hundred years. But the point is, these civilizations really date in their current form from that time period.
And to understand them, including our own, you need to understand those origins. Yeah.
And so our argument is, yes, to know the infancy is a lot of help in knowing the adult, but also this is the civilization that we have. I mean, we are the heirs, importantly, of Rome and Jerusalem.
We're constantly talking about freedom and rights and justice. All that's the Western lexicon. Right,
it is. And so, look at the names of our political parties: Democrat, Republican.
Right.
Look at one could go on and on about the clear fact that we are the heirs of this. But so the question is, how well do we know this?
Right.
And so we looked in this paper. We looked at particularly Northern California. We were somewhat hemmed in by COVID-19 lockdown, but it's just also not that easy to penetrate every state, every school district in the country to find out the intimate details of what's going on. So we decided, well, we'll do what's close to us, and then Morgan Hunter, one of the co-authors, interviewed numerous classics professors at Stanford, Berkeley, and Santa Clara universities. She also reviewed multitudes of K-12 teachers, both in public and private schools, interviewed people in the International Baccalaureate program, communicated with people in prep schools, boarding schools in the East Coast. And we tried to put together, we also dug into the history questions in California. So right now, California doesn't teach history. In fact, it's kind of weak stepchild of
Yeah,
all around the country.
sad.
And we know in education policy that what gets tested is what gets taught.
Just to take a brief breather there, let me just make it clear to everybody who's listening to us, Bill, that when we look at your report, you're titled it kind of with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, "Is it time for a 490 BC project?"
Right.
I want to make it clear, and I think it's becoming more clear now, that it's not that this is itself a 490 BC project. What it is showing the status of classical teaching and knowledge among America's public school children in some representative slices. And it points toward the need for maybe something like 490 BC or whatever date you want to choose, something a lot earlier than the 17th or 18th century.
So we have to have the background of debates over slavery. We have to have the background of debates over constitutional liberty. And so we have a thing about, more detailed thing than I can really give now, about how much of the classics were taught and known in the early years of the United States up through the 19th century. We also talk about another important strain that you could call the practical invention science side of American intellectual thought. So if you think of Benjamin Franklin, he's the man that's, trying to study the character of electricity and all
He knew
sort
his
of thing.
classics and he knew his gadgets.
He knew both. But the thing is, he wanted to make sure that science wasn't neglected, that people weren't only learning about the perils of Julius Caesar, but they also knew some other things. So
in earlier ages, it was tilted toward that side, probably.
That's part of the tradition. Now, what then happens is there's a thing called the progressive era, which begins in the 1890s.
John Dewey comes to mind.
Yes, John Dewey, 1890s. So, and there's other people. He's not the only one, but he's the most famous, and there's no reason to list them all. But the point of this is they had, instead of the idea of education being the transfer by teachers to children of what was important to know in that civilization and to prepare them to thrive in that civilization, the Dewey people, the progressive education people, thought it's all really in the child already. We just need to let them play, let them be creative, let them expand according to what their interests are. And we will give them some guidance, but we'll be very present-minded. So the reason to study ancient Greece for the progressives is not to know the facts, not to draw historical lessons, not to think about the best constitutional design for the United States now and in the future. It's for beautiful city planning.
Right.
Okay. So they were all, of course, they were very into political engineering, rule of experts, managerial control over people by social scientists.
And all this was wrapped up with the curriculum that school children were getting.
So absolutely. They wanted to train you to be part of this. Maybe you were going to become an expert, or maybe you're just going to be a subservient person in the progressive machine. So their idea was to socialize people. So the most famous version of this was a kind of progressive education that came to the fore in the 1940s, where the classes were what to do on a date or how to bake a cherry pie and all the stuff.
Home ec?
It's called life adjustment. Okay.
Okay.
So the idea was not you as an independent thinker, but you as adjusting to what society tells you to do. So all of this is antagonistic to a serious study of history, and as a result,
and it eclipsed study of the classics.
And the word social studies is the progressive embodiment of precisely this idea: present-mindedness, tooling for being either a manager or a managed person. And so they don't like the heroes of these heroes of ancient Rome that the people who assassinated the Tarquin kings. Oh, that's a terrible model, or fought against Caesar or something like that. Somebody might think that they have rights. The progressives were I mean, you can read in Woodrow Wilson his very explicit attacks on Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. And
Right.
it's not because of slavery, I can tell you that.
No,
But
indeed.
Wilson loved slavery. Wilson was he showed the birth of a nation in the White House.
Unbelievable.
So the point of it is they didn't want people that had a sense of their rights and the kinds of notions of justice that you find in ancient Rome, where you have the famous formulation in the Justinian Code of justice is giving every person his due.
His due, right. And moreover, you have the ancient examples, although they were limited, of participation in the civic life.
Exactly. And so the idea of participation for the progressives was not assertive participation, but
it was submissive.
Passive.
Yeah.
Passive, submissive. So
experts.
The experts, the leader who was in tune with the Hegelian notion of the age, the times, the leader and his social science experts would decide what to do, and then the public would ratify.
Right.
That was their whole idea of democracy. It was a very, very watered down kind of democracy.
And you know, what's so striking about this is that for many people today, probably many people our age and younger, certainly, you talk about maybe studying of history or architecture or literature, especially anything to do with politics or history. People say, oh yeah, social studies classes. We had social studies classes. And for many Americans, after that era and up to the present era, the idea of social studies almost seems like a self-evidently true category. Like, what could it be other than social studies? What are you talking about? How can you be against social studies? They never heard of any other way of learning besides putting those...
It's interesting. It's hidden in the name. It's socialization studies.
Socialization studies, right.
It's trying to, I mean, I don't know. We all want people with good manners. We all want people who are decent to other people. We all want to respect other people's rights. That could be termed as socialization, but it could also mean, you know, deference to overweening authority that steps beyond its proper bounds. And these progressives were not really troubled by that at all.
And one of the striking things about Western intellectual history is that some of the most sort of revolutionary thinkers had themselves been trained in the Greek and Roman classics, and from them, interaction with them developed some startlingly new ideas. Even if they were against the West, they all started out from being inspired by the infancy of the West.
And the same is true from Christianity. It's had a long shadow of and Judaism. But I wanted to say a little more about our report. So the first part talks about the history of classics and classic education in the United States. And then it goes over to the errors and how. So not only do they not spend much time, you know, like sixth grade on the ancient world and only part of that on Greco-Roman world, and they're really asking the children to learn too much detail about a lot of stuff. And they don't really focus on the exemplary figures, the myths and legends that might still be of great literary importance and cultural significance. But they have this cramming of dates. Again, I'm not against dates. Dates are like a kind of backbone. Chronology is a kind of backbone on which you stick everything and you know what follows what. And you learn that there are causes and effects to different things happening in history. But they overload it. And it means that they miss the culturally important and interesting things. So, you know, the story of Caesar and Cleopatra, slightly risque, but nonetheless, it's pretty interesting to teenagers, right? So
it's interesting because it's risque.
It's relative to everybody. It's human nature, man. You know, temptation and lust and power and all these sorts of things going on. And okay, well, they just treat it in the most perfunctory way in these textbooks, and they don't allow. They don't allow the interesting things to come to the fore, and that would bring it to life for people. And, you know,
you mentioned in the report something about anecdotal information, not just skills information.
Right. Well, so this is we're going to get into two aspects of this. So one reason is, well, why are these textbooks so bad, and why are they getting worse? So one of the reasons is what could be called a conflict between skills and content in teaching and instruction.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had this period where an extreme form of progressivism was in place. So if you were trying to teach reading, you wouldn't teach the children the building blocks of reading. Okay, so that's word attack skills. It's how to break apart a word and sound it out, how to learn the different sounds. If you have problems and you have what's called graphophonemic awareness problems, you can't quite hear all the sounds in a word, so therefore the words don't make any sense, addressing that. So these skill things have been neglected because of this extreme form of progressivism where they thought reading is like speaking and listening.
You just absorb
natural, right? It'll just come to you naturally, and you should memorize the words like they were Chinese ideograms. Okay, which is clearly wrong. We have this spelling system that actually makes sense if you understand it, and we have how to attack words to break them down so you can read them and you can put them in your mental dictionary and read them rapidly thereafter after you attack them. So skills were neglected. So there was a reaction then in favor of skills. This is typical in education. It sways back and forth like a pendulum all the time. Never just a balanced, sensible approach. Now they do something extreme. So there's this emphasis on skills, but then we have a problem of understanding the material. Maybe you can read the material, but if you don't understand it, we know that if you ask a kid about a thing that he's read or she's read about baseball, and the child knows about baseball, they will be able to comprehend it. If you ask them something about Lee's surrender to Grant, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse at the end of the Civil War, and they don't really have the background on that, they're not going to be able to read it.
No, that's right.
So they're missing this component, the content component. So part of our criticism is that the skewing has been so much in favor of skills, it's been at the neglect of content. So we're trying to bring contact in. We're not attacking skills. We're not attacking STEM, math, science.
You need STEM and history. You need STEM and literature.
It's just a balanced thing where people learn till they specialize in college and things like that. They learn a balance of the different aspects of what it means to be an educated person. And so part of this content that's missing is the background of the humanities. So again, these textbooks are hurt by the skills emphasis, the lack of deep content, and the fact that editors go back in after the original author has written it, and they edit this to have the skills emphasis. And the people who do this don't necessarily know the content at all. So they introduce all sorts of errors. So we found dozens of errors in the main textbooks.
Wow.
And some of them are pretty embarrassing.
Can you remember some details?
We'll give you 4 examples.
Okay.
So here is a kind of minor one. So Acropolis, okay? We think of Athens and we think of the Acropolis. So one of the books says, the Acropolis is the name of the hill. No. The Acropolis is the buildings, the fortress on the top of the hill. It actually means high city if you think about it in Greek. Okay, so here's another one. The Battle of Salamis. So this was another famous battle between the Greeks and the Persians. So Salamis is a bay, it's an island, it's a bay near Athens. And the books, I don't know where they get this, maybe from Sir Francis Drake versus the Spanish Armada or something like that. I don't know where they get it, but they claim the Greeks had these lively, alert ships that ran circles around the Persians and defeated them by their agility, right?
Okay.
Famous little guy beats big guy kind of story. But that's actually not what happened. The Athenians lured the Greeks into this bay, trapped them there. The Greeks had ponderous ships, not flexible ships. And the Greeks trapped them there.
Now, which Greeks were these?
These were Athenians mostly.
The Athenians, okay.
Yeah. So they trapped them there, and then they fought. They boarded the ships of the Persians and fought as if it were a land battle. And that's how they defeated them. So they have the exact opposite is the story they tell. So another one is Et tu, Brute, which we know from Julius Caesar, the play by Shakespeare, right. So, and this, of course, in Latin means and thou, Brutus.
And he took some poetic license, I suppose.
Right.
Shakespeare did.
Well, Shakespeare, he didn't claim to be writing pure history, but he
was an artist.
What he had. So anyway, but the fact is, it's disputed among the different accounts of what happened at Caesar's assassination. But if he said something like this, it was, thou also, child, in Greek, not in Latin. Because the language of aristocratic Romans was Greek. I know that sounds weird to many people today, but it's true. And so that's what he would have said. And then there's the most insanely horrible howler that they have in there, which is echoed in our call for a 490 BC project. And that is that one of the textbooks says that the Battle of Marathon was a naval battle. It could not be more wrong. It was on foot. Okay. And, you could say, you can make up a lot of excuses as to why this mistake happened, but, they mix it up with Salamis. They were thinking of the fact that the Persians had recently disembarked. I don't know what. It's just wrong. Yeah. There's no really valid excuse for having it wrong.
Now, if I were a school kid taking, a classical history class and they had these textbooks and I had these examples of how mistaken the textbooks were, I would love to bring those examples to class with me. But unfortunately, in California, your report says they only get a little smattering of classical history in sixth grade, is it?
Sixth grade, right.
And that's it.
So I wanted to, just even though we're going through these errors, and there are many, many more, but a lot of them are quite complicated, and the viewers would not really be able to pick up on them, and they're welcome to, of course, read them in the report. We have in California the capacity to ask the State Department of Education to ask the publishers to correct the errors, which is a rather cool thing. Not only that, the publisher is supposed to respond. It's not just asking. They are
That's a condition of their contract with the state.
Yeah. And as a complainant, so Victor Davis Hanson and Morgan Hunter and I have put in a complaint letter. We did it yesterday, the day that the report came out. And we copied, we not only sent it to the correct office within the California Department of Education, but we copied the executive director of the State Board of Education, and we copied the members of the State Board of Education. So, and we said in the letter that we want to be apprised of what happens in terms of getting these corrections. So this would be a very good thing if these corrections could be made.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, these books cover other times than ancient Greece and Rome. So, possibly these publishers will think, gee, if we made all these errors in Greece and Rome, maybe we better check the whole book with people that are knowledgeable as these complainers.
Yeah, and an even better outcome would be, of course, if the various school boards would reconsider the way they treat Greco-Roman history in the curriculum is given such incredibly short shrift.
It's given short shrift. And so the third part of our report is about recommendations for reform. And here we look to England, to Great Britain. And the first thing I want to get out of the way, though, is the question of, this might seem like obscure question, but it looms large in the field of classics, and that is, do all children need to learn ancient Latin or ancient Greek in order to get anything out of the classics or out of classical history? I myself learned Latin as a child. Amo, ama, samat, amama, samana, samat. Okay, hic, hike, hook, hui is, hui is, hui.
I admire you, Bill.
I can do all this stuff, okay? And of course, I've lost almost all of it, but I can still probably struggle through a lot of Caesar's Gallic Wars. But the point is, you don't need to do this. We have excellent translations of all important classic works. There are better textbooks than the ones adopted in California. Oxford University Press has an excellent series of books on ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Even going back to the 1940s, there's a book called Augustus Caesar's World. That's a fabulous book talking about this time period.
You're whetting my appetite.
I know. So the British have a slightly different system. Their high school goes on a little longer. Their college kids are a little older. They don't go undergraduate as long. It's slightly different. Obviously, they're cousins. We're cousins of them, or they're cousins of us, or however you want to think of the educational system. But they have a serious attention to the knowledge of the classical world. And they have two levels of studying this, sort of regular student level and something that would be similar to advanced placement in the United States. And there's no reason that American schools could not add this. We looked at the schedules in the various high schools in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's room instead of some of the lesser value electives that are in there to take this that would be seriously helpful to advancing student knowledge, making more educated, more cultivated citizens out of these young people. There's room for this. The British people find, obviously, room for it. They have prime ministers that can quote an hour of Greek or Latin. I'm not saying that we need that. I don't think we do.
The current prime minister.
The current prime minister can do that, and it's kind of impressive when he does it.
Right.
It's just
you suggest there's a model in the British General Certificate of Secondary Education?
Yeah, there are two different degrees that you can get along these lines, but I do think it's completely can be done in English.
Right.
And you're going to learn something of Greek and Roman roots, and you'll learn things that you'll realize helicopter is made up of helix, like the double helix, and pter, which means wing, so it's helix type wing, and you'll understand how weird it is to abbreviate it as copter. Anyway, so there's all sorts of interesting things that might come up from just picking up some Greek history and Roman history, but the main thing is to give you the background for the humanities. So the humanities in college and in graduate school and just in life, if you're appreciating symphony and opera and art museums and all of this, it helps to know what's going on. I mean, if you have a painting of Romulus and Remus, well, who were Romulus and Remus,
Right.
If you have Castor and Pollux, what's going on here? Who is this Venus on a half shell? Who is Venus anyway?
Right, exactly.
It's not just Venus Williams. There's a reason why Venus Williams is named Venus Williams.
Exactly. She's named for a much more ancient Venus.
Yes. And if somebody says, that's his Achilles heel, what are they referring to? They're referring to something.
Yeah.
Okay. So these cultural references, they're part of what E.D. Hirsch, Jr., the English professor at University of Virginia, now retired, of course, but what he calls cultural literacy. And we're missing a huge amount of cultural literacy by not having our kids dig deeper into ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The facts, the ideas, the personalities, the political and cultural structures.
I got a comment saying, well, why isn't AP World History good enough for this kind of stuff?
Well, like many things, there are battles in educational policy over what should be included.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who think, well, world history is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so, because these other countries that we have to deal with come from somewhere.
Yeah, they have their histories too.
China does not just appear magically in 1949 or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So they have their histories that tells a lot about where their culture, political culture, is coming from. But the key problem with the advanced placement is that it only begins in 1250.
Oh.
So this is,
wow, that late.
Yeah, this is good for certain things. I mean, it's going to pick up. So we think of the Renaissance as much later than that, but there is a medieval Renaissance, if you will, that's going on at this time, and a huge amount of advancement of learning, both inventions and technical devices, but also science and philosophy and literature is going on beginning at that time. But that's really not going back far enough. I mean, it's good for what it is, but where's the people before 1250?
Exactly. We need to bring this to a wrap up here pretty quick, I think. But, you know, it is amazing the degree of historical amnesia that contemporary Americans do suffer from. And it really is directly the result of how the educational curriculum has become so circumscribed, so myopic, so modern. We're fighting about things that we don't even know the background of what we're fighting about.
And our young people, when they read a newspaper or they read online about various things, they don't know the cultural reference. If somebody says, "Oh, what a stoical response," what's a stoic?
What's a stoic?
I don't know what that is.
Right.
But if you have some classical background, you know something about this.
Yeah, you do. And you have a whole lot more, of course, than students are going to get out of the current critical race theory curricula that are taking over our schools, which are even more myopic than the progressives, actually.
It's really it's so racially determinist. It's so totalitarian in attitude.
Right.
It's so counter to the whole spirit of America. And I can't believe if you teach everybody race is the only thing, there's nothing that can be done to become a non-racist. You're stuck being a racist.
Well, you can
I
self-denounce.
can't think that this story. No, even that you're still a racist.
But you're still a racist.
Self-denounce.
Yeah. Right.
The point is, this can't really be good for a racial minority to give up individual rights, to give up pluralism, to give up toleration, to give up freedom of speech. This is not a good recipe for people who are in a minority. The state, the modern state, tends to be naturally a totalizing institution. And it doesn't like anomalies. It doesn't like state-like regularity. They like monopoly. They like uniformity of control. There's this whole book called Seeing Like a State by James Scott. That great
powerful
insight into this. And people who think that this racial outlook thing is going to work, they're just setting the stage for something really horrible to happen.
We've all been, in our country and in our civilization more broadly, sheltered under the leaves of a very great oak tree that has deep roots that go in many directions. And if we start chopping out those roots, the tree is going to fall on top of us and we will all be worse off. So a little education that goes back considerably farther will be a big help. So thank you, and to Victor Davis Hanson and Morgan Hunter for the work you did on this report. I hope it gets wide circulation, and I hope that parents and school boards and everyone who cares about the education of our young citizens will take a look at this and reconsider and be willing to look.
We've already seen hundreds of people sharing this. And
I noticed that.
if it gets wider sharing, then it will get wider attention.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there is a concern, there is an appetite for this. If you are moved by these kind of concerns, as our participant, you are not alone, actually. So stick with us. Thank you very much to Bill Evers, also to his co-authors, again, Morgan Hunter and Victor Davis Hanson. Thank you to our friends who have joined us through ThinkSpot and also through other venues from around the country and even around the world. Please keep in touch with the Independent Institute. You can download this report. Is it time for a 490 BC project? High schoolers need to know our classical heritage at independent.org, and you'll find the article there, and then you can download the document and share it with your friends. Keep in touch with us for resources that can enable you to keep up with antidotes to some of the modern errors, the errors of our era, which do have answers. We are not stuck. We do have resources to draw on, and Bill Evers, you're helping us to find them. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care, and come back to visit us at the Independent Institute.